Now we're going to do some examples of the leg, and this will probably be a good opportunity to show you something that really applies to arms and legs equally, is that if you draw these primitive forms stacked too evenly, it will just look very boring. Okay, so even though this can get you started and still give you a sense of form and depth on the page, it's just too evenly stacked. Even the proportions seem odd at this point. This area probably needs to be longer, but that's really not what's really negatively impacting this as much as just the fact that they're just too even. So you can still start this way based on the fact, based on the idea that you're going to change it. But what I like to do is actually try to avoid it even in the beginning. So even when I'm using my primitive forms, I will draw it a bit more like this. So what this allows me to do is to get a better sense of an organic feeling to these otherwise stiff shapes. So that's really the purpose of incorporating the stage of it. So you're basically taking the primitive forms and then adding just a little bit of that organic feeling to them. Okay, so really what I'm trying to pinpoint here as I do this is that this has a bit of curve, so I'm kind of jumping past the primitives a little bit, and this is relatively straight by comparison to the outer edge. And so if we carry on with that, okay, let's soft erase this back. So when you go to draw an actual leg, again, you're going to get that curvature from the outside. The outside of the leg is not the same as the inside of the leg. It starts thicker to the top. It bows inward here. You get that calf muscle jutting out like that. Your inside ankle, which is higher. And I won't detail this too far because we're going to get into this more specifically, and I don't want to rush you through the other areas, but what I want you to think about is that even in that primitive state, that first starting point, you can start to aid yourself in the process. So if you're too strict in your approach on the first example, then it might affect where you end up on your final example. So trying to think organically as you move forward through this process is a big deal. Now, next, we're going to get into gesture drawing, and that also plays a big role. And then we're also going to talk about rhythms, and one of the rhythms of the leg that I find really helpful, actually I'll draw this with the red to make it easier for you to see what I'm talking about here, is a rhythm that goes right through the leg, like this. And so we'll talk about that with the anatomy and that, but basically that long S curve is very helpful so that you don't draw legs too straight up and down, and really so you don't draw the anatomy and the portions of the legs stacked, like stacked blocks. And again, that's why I think it's really important when I explain these techniques that yes, we can start with the stereometric and basic primitive shapes approach. It helps in a lot of things, perspective and alignment and proportions like I've mentioned before, but it can be negative if you stick to it too wholeheartedly. And I've seen that with a lot of young artists where they learn this first method and then they kind of, they don't break away from it at the proper times, and then they end up with overly stiff characters. So again, these rhythms are important. Again, pay attention to the fact that the leg curves here, that's relatively straight. It's not straight, but a lot straighter by comparison on the inner portion of the leg, the medial side. And then if you also notice, you get a bit of a diamond-like shape right here, where you have a very elongated curve on the other side. So it's paying attention to those differences, and this occurs in the arms, the legs. It's very noticeable once you start to spot it that the insides are different than the outsides. So again, I just wanted to share that part with you. So now let's do some examples of the leg, but I want to slowly start to integrate this other way of thinking as we do this, so that you don't stay too stiff in the approach. Okay, so for our next example, let's do a bent leg, and I'm just going to throw in a basic guide. So like I said, we are going to get into gestures next, and this is where you really start to utilize some of these things to figure out, the placement of the cylinders. So for instance, we bring this leg out. We know the knee is going to be in here somewhere. Maybe we need to extend the distance here. We drop in the other cylinder. We taper it down because we know it gets a lot thinner to the ankle. And we put some kind of blocky form of the foot in place, something like that. And then based upon the way the person is leaning with their weight, the pelvis is going to be back here somewhere. So let's just do the leg for now. So basically, again, it's one of those areas of the body where this in particular is something that I almost instinctively want to pull reference from. And by reference, I mean, I think I've already mentioned it. It can be photos. It can be photos you take of yourself. I actually recommend that quite highly because you're not searching endlessly for a specific pose. So to me, it makes a lot more sense. I have a camera and a tripod set up. Now, obviously, I don't fit the narrative for every character I want to draw, but I can at least get the pose, and I've gotten good enough at looking through it as a bit of a, reference point, but not a, nothing I can stick to wholeheartedly to. And, but, I've also gotten good with my imagination where I can do a lot of adjusting on the fly and get closer and closer to something I need to see. And that's really the part that I stress the most, because you really don't want to be stuck having to pull reference all the time. It's great, but then you want to also develop your own ability to use your imagination and your bit of your memory. So as we have these cylinders in place, and again, we wouldn't know until we fully went through it with the anatomy whether or not this was something we like for the pose. To me, I feel like it is salvageable, but then I can also turn this. I don't have to leave it right here, right? I can adjust these cylinders a lot easier than I can adjust drawing leg anatomy. And then also remember that you have wrapping lines. So wrapping lines are basically just, I actually tend to think of these more as 3D grids, because I used to do 3D animation. So designing 3D shapes, you see these grids all through your objects, right? Your prisms and that. So basically, you can think in terms of that. And what this really does, just like the overall cylinders do, is it really helps you to see the direction that your forms are going in. And you can, you can do center points, you can do multiple little ovals to the middle, and you start to get a very dimensional feeling to all of this. So I really recommend doing this. I do this quite a bit in my illustrations. I almost always draw a center line to each area of the illustration as I'm sketching through it, especially if I start to run into a bit of a stumbling block. The center lines just seem to help me quite a lot. So yeah, you can do this. Another technique as well is to add in some sort of value. So a lot of times I will do this to think more dimensionally about my work. So I might take a different brush, and this could be a marker if you're working traditionally. I'll just block in a bit of value. So this is obviously too dark, but then what I'll do, just like I would use a marker, is I would tone this way back, because I just want that little bit of value. And we'll be doing studies obviously where we create value studies. So again, I'm just introducing some of these concepts to you because at this point I want you to think more dimensionally about these areas of the body, and then we're going to combine the ideas. We're going to combine the primitive shape drawings, the gesture drawings, the anatomy and the rendering, all that stuff coupled together. But this part, I just find to be helpful. So when I get into the anatomy, I'll add in this value right through the anatomy. I'm kind of just faking it a little bit right there to show you what I mean. But I'll do that all through the design, and it helps me to feel like I'm looking at something that's occupying 3D space. Just like adding a shadow to the ground plane immediately makes it feel like there's some depth and dimension there, a little bit more than there was before I did that. So again, these are all just techniques to get your brain going, to get these ideas expressed. Let's go ahead and do some more versions of this, because I think it's a very helpful thing to practice, and hopefully it gets you a better sense of drawing the leg from different views. I don't want to just give you one view here. So with that, let's stop here and head over to our next lesson.